It seems like everywhere you look these days, tariffs are making headlines. And then there's all this talk about a potential 145% increase. It's a lot to wrap your head around, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not an economist, and I don't want to need a PhD just to understand what's going on in the world.
You're telling me. It can definitely feel like you're drowning in numbers sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of the point, right? These headlines are meant to grab your attention, but what we really need to do is dig a little deeper. Figure out what these tariffs actually mean, the why, the how, and what they might mean for all of us. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. Get some clarity without the overwhelm, so to speak.
Right on. So today's deep dive is all about tariffs. We'll start with those crazy headlines, that whole 145% thing, and then we'll get down to the basics. What exactly are tariffs? And how are they being calculated right now? We'll look at that White House formula and how it's tied to trade imbalances.
And to get some perspective, we'll also take a trip back in time, look at some past trade wars, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs back in the Great Depression, that kind of thing. History can teach us a lot about what might happen today.
And speaking of today, we'll zoom back to 2025 and analyze what these tariffs mean for our current economic landscape. And because everything's connected, we'll even talk about some potential future impacts, like how trade policies can sometimes tie into climate risks. And to wrap it all up, we'll explore some steps that everyone, from financial institutions to governments and even individuals, can take.
To get a full picture, we've pulled information from all over the place. We're looking at news from outlets like The Guardian, Channel News Asia, and The Business Times, along with analyses from economists like Jonathan Portes and Thomas Sampson. Plus, we're factoring in historical events like Smoot-Hawley and the Bretton Woods system. Oh, and we'll even touch on some broader economic ideas from people like Mike Maloney. It's like a crash course in tariffs.
All right, let's dive right in with those headlines. That potential 145% tariff figure, what's the story there?
The biggest development in the news lately has been these massive tariff increases, especially those targeting China. We're seeing reports that tariffs on Chinese goods have skyrocketed to a whopping 125%.
125%, that's a lot.
It is. It's a huge leap from the initial 34% that was being discussed. Talk about escalating trade tensions.
Wow, from 34% to 125%. That's not messing around. How did China react to that?
They didn't waste any time. China retaliated almost immediately after the U.S. announced those higher tariffs. They slapped an 84% duty on U.S. goods. It was a strong, decisive response.
So a tit for tat. Makes sense. What about the markets? Did all this news have an impact there?
It did. There were some pretty significant reactions on April 9th, 2025. We saw U.S. Treasury bonds being sold off, which pushed the yield on the 10-year Treasury up to about 4.4%. That was the highest it had been since February. The tech-heavy NASDAQ took a big hit too, dropping over 4%, with companies like Apple and Nvidia seeing their stock prices fall. Even oil prices dipped below $64 a barrel.
So investors were definitely paying attention. But I remember hearing something about what the Treasury Secretary said about all of this.
Yeah, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He didn't seem too concerned. He said he didn't see anything out of the ordinary in the market activity.
Really? With all those drops and shifts, that's interesting.
It definitely raised some eyebrows.
It did. I know The Guardian broke down these tariffs by country. What did that tell us about the global impact?
The Guardian's list showed that these tariffs aren't a one-size-fits-all situation. While China is facing that huge 125% rate, other countries are being treated differently. Some have tariffs closer to that initial 10% figure, but then there are some pretty big jumps for others. So it seems like they're really targeting China, while the impact on other countries is more varied. At least for now.
Okay, so we've seen the headlines and the market reactions. Now let's talk about what tariffs actually are and how they're calculated, the nitty-gritty.
Sure. In simple terms, a tariff is a tax a government puts on goods imported from another country. They're used for a few different reasons, often to protect domestic industries, make those imports more expensive so people buy local products instead. They can also be a way for governments to raise money, although that's usually not the main goal, especially when we're talking about trade disputes. And as we're seeing now, tariffs are definitely used to try and address what a country sees as unfair trade relationships.
Right. And this formula the White House is using, the one with all the confusing symbols, how does that work?
It is a little technical, I'll admit. The White House says this formula is meant to reduce bilateral trade deficits, Basically, the difference between how much the U.S. exports to a country and how much it imports from that country.
So what does this magic formula look like?
It's a little bit complex, but it looks like this delta tau I equals xi minus mi divided by epsilon times 4 times mi all over 2.
Okay, so I'm already lost in the symbols.
Yeah, no worries. Let's break it down.
Please.
So xi represents the value of U.S. exports to a particular country. Let's call it country I.
Okay.
And mi is the value of U.S. imports from that same country.
Right, so you're looking at the difference between those two.
Exactly. Then we have this Greek letter epsilon, which represents how sensitive the demand for imports is to changes in price.
Okay.
Like if the price goes up, will people stop buying it or not?
Got it.
Economists call this price elasticity. And the White House, they set this value at 4 based on some economic research.
Okay.
Basically, it means that even a small price increase could lead to a significant decrease in how much people buy.
Interesting.
Then we have phi, which is the pass-through rate.
Okay.
This estimates how much of the tariff actually gets added to the price that consumers pay.
Right, because businesses could choose to absorb some of that cost.
Exactly. And this was set at 0.25. So a 10% tariff, for example, would theoretically only add 2 under 5% to the final price.
Okay, and the rest is on the businesses.
Right. And then lastly, the whole result of that calculation is divided by 2.
Okay, so you plug in all those trade numbers and those elasticity and pass-through rates, and out pops a tariff percentage.
Exactly.
Hold on, so they're taking the trade deficit, comparing it to total imports, considering how much we react to price changes and how much of the tariff gets passed on to us, and they're just cutting it in half, just like that.
Yeah, pretty much. And they've given some examples. For China, they had a trade deficit of $295 billion and $440 billion in imports. Their initial calculation was around 67%, but they halved it to get that initial 34% tariff. For the EU, it was a $235.6 billion deficit with $605.8 billion in imports, so their calculated rate was about 40%, which was also cut in half to 20%.
Okay, so that's how they got those numbers. But I've heard this method has been criticized quite a bit.
Oh yeah, definitely. Economists have pointed out several problems. One big one is that this formula only looks at trade in goods. It completely ignores the massive surplus the U.S. has in services trade, like digital trade, financial services, and tourism. That surplus was around $1.7 trillion in 2024. So by focusing only on goods, you're missing a big part of the picture.
Right, services are a huge part of the U.S. economy these days. What else are experts saying?
They're also saying that the formula doesn't look at the bigger picture when it comes to trade balances. It ignores things like exchange rates, differences in savings and investment levels between countries, and how complicated global supply chains really are. Professor Jonathan Portes has argued that tariffs calculated this way might shrink the trade deficit with a specific country, but they're not going to fix the U.S.'s overall trade imbalance. It's like patching a hole in a sinking ship without addressing the bigger problem.
Just a temporary fix then.
Exactly. Some economists even think this formula might have been created after they already decided on the tariff levels. Like they had the numbers in mind and then came up with a formula to justify them. Thomas Sampson from the London School of Economics called it a costly rationalization, saying it doesn't really fit with standard economic theory. There are also questions about the assumptions they used in the formula, like setting that price elasticity of demand at 4. That suggests we're very sensitive to price changes, but some studies argue it should be lower. And of course, there's that whole having the tariff rate thing, which seems more like a political move than an economic one.
So basically, there are lots of questions about how they're doing all this, and I'm guessing this isn't the only way to calculate tariffs.
Not at all. There are other, more established methods. One is called reciprocal tariffs, where a country basically tries to match the tariffs and trade barriers that its trading partners have in place. The U.S. formula ignores that completely. Then there are ad valorem tariffs, which are a fixed percentage of the imported product's value. For example, a 10% tariff on all imported cars. And finally, there are specific tariffs, which are a fixed fee charged for each unit of an imported good. Like $50 for every imported bicycle tire.
Wow, so many different ways to do this. Okay, let's shift gears for a minute and talk about history. Where did this whole idea of using tariffs as a weapon even come from?
Tariffs have a long history, going back to ancient times. We have records from Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE showing taxes on things like timber and metals. The Roman Empire also used import and export taxes called portoria to fund their infrastructure and military. In medieval Europe, it was common for feudal lords to charge tolls on goods passing through their lands. But the idea of tariffs as a major tool for a country's economy really took off during the mercantilist era, from the 16th to the 18th centuries. European powers like Britain and France used high tariffs to protect their industries and grow their wealth.
So using tariffs to protect domestic industries has been around for a while.
Oh yeah, it's a recurring theme in economic history, and there are some really interesting examples from more recent times that are relevant to what's happening today.
Like what? Give us a couple of examples.
Well, in the UK, there were the Corn Laws, which lasted from 1815 to 1846. These were designed to protect British landowners from competition after the Napoleonic Wars, but they caused bread prices to soar and increased poverty, leading to a lot of public anger and their eventual repeal. Then, in the US, there was the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. It was meant to protect northern industries, but the southern states who relied on imports hated it. It almost led to the US breaking apart.
Wow, so tariffs causing some serious internal struggles. Any examples of them impacting things on a global scale?
That brings us to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, probably the most famous example of how tariffs can go wrong. It raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to an average of 59%, which was incredibly high. The goal was to protect American jobs during the Great Depression. But other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, and global trade plummeted by a crazy 66% between 1929 and 1934. It was a disaster, making the Depression even worse and contributing to massive unemployment. It took President Roosevelt's Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934 to start reversing course and gradually lower those tariffs.
That sounds like a pretty big warning sign for what's happening now.
It definitely is. The risks from the Smoot-Hawley era, things like global retaliation, collapsing trade, and making economic downturns worse, are all very relevant today. And as Mike Maloney has pointed out, Smoot-Hawley was followed by the U.S. nationalizing gold and revaluing it in the 1930s. So there might be a connection between extreme protectionist trade policies and big changes in monetary policy.
History definitely has some lessons for us. Let's bring things back to 2025. How does today's situation compare to these past episodes? What are the similarities and differences?
One key difference is where we're starting from. We already have a lot of tariffs in place from previous years, especially on goods from China. Research from the Peterson Institute for International Economics shows that the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods went from about 3.1% in early 2018 to 19.3% by 2020, and it stayed around there, only increasing to 20.8% in 2024 and early 2025. So this recent jump to 124.8% is a much bigger deal. It's a whole new level of intensity in this trade war.
So we're not starting from scratch. Given this rapid increase, what are some potential downsides we might see in our current economy?
Economists are worried about a few things. Inflation is a big one. The Federal Reserve has said these high tariffs will likely lead to higher prices for everyone, and that could slow down economic growth. We already saw some market jitters with those drops in U.S. Treasuries and the NASDAQ on April 9th. There's a real risk that these tariffs could lead to a recession or hurt specific industries that depend on imports or face retaliation from other countries.
But the U.S. administration must have some reasons for doing this, right? What are they hoping to achieve?
The U.S. Trade Representative has called these tariffs reciprocal measures, meaning they're a response to what they see as unfair trade practices from other countries. They've also said they see tariffs as a way to force trading partners to make concessions in trade deals and other economic issues. But some people have pointed out flaws in this logic. For example, the U.S. itself admitted they didn't fully assess existing foreign barriers before putting these tariffs in place. And the fact that they've paused and made exemptions based on how the market reacts shows that their strategy might be a bit unpredictable. Some economists say this is more likely to spark more trade disputes than lead to any real lasting agreements.
And with tariffs getting this high, are there any unintended consequences we should be watching out for?
Absolutely. History shows that when tariffs get really high, they can lead to some unexpected things. Smuggling becomes more attractive, and so does transshipment, where goods are routed through a third country to avoid those tariffs. This can undermine the whole point of the tariffs and create new problems for customs and trade regulations.
Okay, so it's not as simple as it seems. Let's take a look at things from China's perspective. How are they likely viewing all of this?
China sees this as part of a bigger strategy by the U.S. to contain them, to stop them from growing economically and gaining more global influence. They're not happy about these tariffs at all. They've accused the U.S. of bullying and have filed a case against them with the World Trade Organization, saying these new tariffs violate WTO rules. They also say they're not intentionally trying to have a trade surplus with the U.S. They see it as a result of problems within the U.S. economy and the way global production is organized.
So they're not just sitting back and taking it. What are they doing strategically to respond to this trade war?
China is definitely making moves. They're shifting towards what's called decoupling from the U.S., not just in trade, but in technology, finance, and even culture. They're diversifying their trade partners so the U.S. is a smaller part of their overall exports. They're also trying to become more self-sufficient, especially when it comes to semiconductors, which are really important for their tech industry.
So they're trying to rely less on the U.S. Are there any other strategic moves we might see from them?
Some experts think that China might not see much point in trying to make big trade deals with the U.S. right now, given the current climate. Instead, there's talk of a more focused agreement on currency. A stronger Chinese RMB could benefit China, while a weaker dollar might be good for the U.S. in some ways. Plus, this kind of agreement might be easier to get approved than a big trade deal.
It sounds like things are changing between these two countries. I also noticed something about China strengthening its ties with its neighbors.
Yeah, that's another part of their strategy. President Xi Jinping has been talking about building stronger relationships with other Asian countries, especially when it comes to trade and economic cooperation. He's also planning state visits to Malaysia, Vietnam, and Cambodia, so they're clearly prioritizing their regional relationships.
Okay, so that's where things stand today. Let's look ahead now. Earlier, we talked about the connection between trade policies and climate risks. How do those two things intersect?
The link between climate risks, trade, and the global economy is becoming more and more obvious. Tariffs can actually make some environmental problems worse. For example, there's something called carbon leakage. If one country puts tariffs on high carbon imports to protect its own industries, companies might just move their production to countries with weaker environmental rules. So it doesn't really reduce global emissions, it just shifts them somewhere else.
So it's not a real solution, just moving the problem around.
Exactly. And then there's the growing risk of climate change disrupting global supply chains. Extreme weather events like floods, droughts, and heat waves, which are becoming more common because of climate change, can seriously impact production and transportation. Imagine if there were major floods in China, a major manufacturing hub for electronics and so many other things. It would have ripple effects all over the world.
And what about the economic risks that come directly from climate change? How do tariffs fit into that?
Climate change presents both physical and transition risks to the economy. Physical risks include things like assets becoming worthless, like fossil fuel infrastructure, and big drops in GDP due to extreme weather. Transition risks come from the shift to a low-carbon economy. For instance, the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, puts a levy on imports from countries with high carbon emissions. This could really impact U.S. exports in sectors that produce a lot of carbon, like a green tariff imposed by Europe.
I remember reading something about the U.S. and carbon levies on shipping.
Yes, the U.S. recently pulled out of talks at the International Maritime Organization about reducing emissions from shipping. They were against putting a carbon levy on ships based on their emissions, and even threatened to retaliate if any fees were put on U.S. vessels. They also didn't want any money from such a levy to be used for environmental projects outside the shipping industry. This doesn't look good for international cooperation on climate action when it comes to trade.
It sounds like climate change is a problem for everyone, no matter their trade policies.
Absolutely. From wildfires and hurricanes in the U.S. to pushback against the EU's CBAM, to China dealing with pollution and water shortages, to India's heat waves, to Singapore's vulnerability to rising sea levels, climate change affects us all. Trade policies can either help us transition to a more sustainable economy or get in the way. There's been talk about green tariffs, which would penalize imports based on their carbon footprint, but putting those into practice is a complicated issue.
This is all very complex. Given all this, trade wars and climate risks, what can different groups like financial institutions, governments, and individuals actually do?
Well, for financial institutions like banks, asset managers, and insurance companies, there are a few things they can focus on. They should diversify their investments and loans towards businesses with ESG-compliant supply chains, which are more likely to be resilient in the long run. Given the potential for market instability due to trade wars, hedging currency risks will be important. They also need to consider geopolitical risks, including trade wars, in their financial models, and insurers need to develop better coverage for trade disruptions.
And what about governments? What should they be doing?
Governments need to move away from going it alone and work together to revive and reform the WTO. That would make global trade more stable and predictable. They should also consider including climate metrics in future trade deals, maybe even using carbon tariffs along with other measures to align trade and environmental goals. And they could explore offering exemptions from green tariffs for sustainable goods.
And what about regular people? What can we do, whether we're in the US, Europe, China, India, or Singapore?
Individuals can make a difference by supporting local and sustainable goods whenever possible. This tells businesses that we care about the environment and local economies. We can also contact our elected officials and push for policies that address the links between climate change and trade. Supporting businesses that are adopting greener practices is important too.
We also heard about Profitable Earth consulting services. How can they help businesses navigate these challenging times?
Profitable Earth Consulting Services helps businesses deal with the complexities of trade wars and create strategies that are resilient to both tariffs and climate risks. They can help map global supply chains to find potential vulnerabilities, integrate sustainability into business operations, and advocate for policies that support sustainable trade. You can find more information on their website, profitableearth.com.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive into tariffs and everything that comes with them. To leave you with something to think about, consider this. Can we redesign tariffs so they encourage sustainability without causing economic instability? How can we balance national interests with global cooperation when it comes to trade and climate change? We're at a crossroads here.
That's a crucial question to ponder. We've gone through a lot today, from the history of trade wars to how tariffs are calculated and their potential impact on the economy and the environment. I encourage you to keep exploring these topics and dive deeper into the areas that interest you.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of tariffs. It's a complicated topic, but hopefully we've shed some light on it for you.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Until next time, keep asking questions and stay informed.